Hello, and welcome back to Horror Stories Audio. For our returning listeners, thank you for stepping back into the shadows with us. Tonight, we follow a trail that was never meant to be found, where ancient symbols carved into bark are not an invitation to a lost world, but a desperate, centuries-old warning to stay away. Settle in and prepare yourself. If you enjoy the embrace of fear, consider liking this story and subscribing to the channel. It helps the darkness find others like us. I'm telling you, the topographicals from the 50s show it should be just over this ridge, Chloe. Liam's voice, a familiar mix of breathless optimism and bravado, echoed slightly in the dense woods. He pushed a low-hanging fern frond from his face, his eyes gleaming. This is gonna be epic. The Street Jude's logging camp. Nobody's found a single trace of it since it vanished in the 20 seconds. From about 20 feet behind him, Chloe swatted a mosquito from her arm, her expression a well-practiced look of patient skepticism. The topographicals from the 50s also show a little drawing of a sea monster in the corner of the map, Liam. It's called cartographic flare. She adjusted the heavy pack on her shoulders, her movements economical and sure-footed where Liam's were a series of energetic lunges. The official record says the camp was decommissioned, not that it vanished. You and your dramatic YouTube titles. Liam just grinned, hoisting his camera onto his shoulder. He spun around, walking backward now, filming himself and Chloe behind him. All right, trailblazers, if you're watching this, it means the signal is gone and we are deep in the backcountry of the Monongahela National Forest. And according to my not at all dramatic research, he said, winking at the lens, we're getting close. The air is getting thick with history and humidity. He was a natural performer, always searching for the next big discovery, the video that would push his channel over the edge. Chloe just rolled her eyes, a gesture of fond exasperation. She was here for the friendship and for the remote possibility that Liam's obsessive research might actually turn up a legitimate historical curiosity. She was the anchor to his hot air balloon, the rational analyst to his ambitious explorer. The forest around them was ancient and deeply indifferent. The world was a cathedral of green and brown, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying pine needles. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy above, dappling the forest floor in shifting hypnotic patterns. It was a world away from everything, a place where the normal rules of civilization felt thin and distant. For 2 hours, the only sounds were their own footsteps, the buzzing of insects and Liam's intermittent narration to his camera. He was about 50 yards ahead when he suddenly stopped. He didn't call out. He just froze, his body rigid. Chloe paused, a prickle of unease touching her skin. Liam, you find a poison ivy patch to fall in? He didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The usual YouTuber hype was gone, replaced by a quiet, genuine awe. Chloe, you need to see this. She made her way to where he was standing, pushing past the same fern frond he had. He was standing before a massive, ancient oak tree, its bark a gnarled and deeply grooved landscape. And carved into it, at about eye level, was a symbol. It was clearly man-made, but it was unlike any graffiti she had ever seen. It was a complex, swirling spiral, the lines cut deep into the bark, intersecting with a strange, almost mathematical precision. It seemed to draw the eye inward, towards its tight, dark center. It was old, the edges of the cuts weathered and gray, yet it felt vibrant. Liam slowly lowered his camera, his mouth slightly agape. This isn't logging territory markings, he whispered. This is older, way older. His eyes were wide with the electrifying thrill of the unknown. The forgotten logging camp was instantly and completely erased from his mind. This was something else. This was real. Chloe, however, leaned in closer, her academic curiosity overriding her initial shock. She pulled her phone out, snapping several pictures from different angles. She ran her fingers lightly over the carving, feeling the texture. "It's incredible," she breathed, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The design doesn't match any known petroglyphs from the regional tribes. Not even close." She paused, tracing the edge of one of the deeper cuts. "And it's strange. For a carving that looks this old, the wood inside the cut, it almost looks fresh. There's almost no decay." It was an odd remark. A small, innocent clue that didn't fit the triumphant narrative of discovery Liam was already building in his head. But for Chloe, it was the first subtle note in a melody that was deeply, deeply wrong. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the undersides of the clouds in hues of orange and pink, a beautiful sight that did nothing to quell the nervous energy buzzing under my skin. Liam was still captivated by the tree, circling it like a predator, his camera clicking and whirring, capturing every possible angle. "We're losing the light, Liam," Chloe said, her voice pulling him from his trance. "We need to make camp. Now." He finally tore his eyes away from the carving, his face flushed with an almost manic excitement. "Right, yeah, base camp. Operation Uncover History's Greatest Secret begins here." They chose a small, relatively flat clearing about 50 yards from the oak, close enough to keep an eye on it, but far enough to give them a sense of their own space. The process of setting up was a study in contrasts. Liam moved with a distracted haste, his mind clearly elsewhere as he unfurled their high-tech two-person tent. Chloe, on the other hand, was methodical, her movements precise as she cleared the ground, checked for roots, and laid out the ground sheet. The mundane, familiar actions of setting up a temporary home in the wilderness seemed to ground her, a small pocket of order in a day that had suddenly become very, very strange. Once the tent was up, Liam was immediately back in his element, not as a woodsman, but as a digital archaeologist. He unpacked a Pelican case, revealing a laptop, a portable battery pack, and an array of cables and sensors. "The photogrammetry rig should give us a perfect 3D model by morning," he explained, more to his camera than to Chloe. He was in full YouTuber mode, his voice a low, excited murmur. "We could be looking at a cultural fingerprint, trailblazers. A previously unknown people who use these woods as their canvas." He theorized wildly, his enthusiasm boundless. Maybe a splinter sect of a known tribe that developed their own unique symbology. Or, and this is the long shot, but imagine a lost settler group, cut off from the world, creating their own new world out here in the wilds. Liam was a true believer, his desire for a groundbreaking discovery, a powerful, driving force. Chloe said nothing. She had the small camp stove going, the hiss of the butane a starkly modern sound in the ancient woods. She was preparing a simple meal of dehydrated noodles, but her movements were automatic. Her attention was on the photo she had taken, which she was now reviewing on her phone, pinching and zooming, her brow creased in a deep, worried line. The juxtaposition was jarring. Liam, 10 feet away, using sophisticated technology to map a fantasy, while she, with a simple photo, was staring at a contradiction she couldn't resolve. The carving technique was clearly archaic, made with primitive tools. But the detail, the impossible lack of erosion and decay inside the cuts, it was a paradox. It was as if someone with the skills of an ancient craftsman had made the carving only yesterday. The unease she had felt earlier was solidifying into a genuine, cold knot of dread. This was a subtle but deeply unsettling clue. Later, as they sat by the small, contained flame of the stove, the debate finally came to a head. "I've cross-referenced every known symbol from the Adena, the Hopewell, even the Monongahela people," Chloe said, her voice quiet but firm. "This spiral, it doesn't match anything. Not just the design, but the context. It's a singular object with no other cultural markers around it. It feels wrong, Liam. Wrong? Chloe, it's perfect, he countered, his eyes shining in the low light. It's an anomaly. That's what makes it a discovery. You're looking for reasons to disqualify it, to fit it into a box that already exists. I'm telling you, this is the box nobody's ever seen before. Or it's a hoax, she said flatly. A really, really good one. Made to fool people exactly like you. The word stung, and Liam fell silent for a moment. You don't really believe that, he said, his voice losing some of its bravado. Chloe sighed, stirring her noodles. She looked from his hopeful, desperate face to the immense silent darkness of the forest that surrounded them. She didn't know what she believed, but she knew that Liam wouldn't let this go. And a part of her, the small adventurous part that had agreed to this trip in the first place, was undeniably curious. Okay, Liam, she said finally. Okay. One day, we follow the trail tomorrow. We see where it leads. But the second it feels weirder than it already does, we turn back. No arguments. Deal? A slow, triumphant grin spread across Liam's face. Deal. He went back to his laptop, excitedly plotting potential routes based on the direction the first symbol seemed to indicate. But Chloe couldn't share his enthusiasm. She stared past the small flame of their stove into the deep, impenetrable blackness of the woods. She had agreed, but the feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. The morning broke crisp and clear, a deceptively cheerful start to a day that hung heavy with unspoken tension. They left their main camp standing, a lonely outpost of civilization, and packed only the essentials for a day hike. Water, food, first aid, and Liam's considerable array of camera gear. Liam was practically vibrating with excitement, a man on the verge of rewriting history. Chloe was quiet, her features set in a mask of cautious resolve. She had made a deal, and she would see it through, but every step she took away from their camp felt like a step into deeper, colder water. They found the second carving easily, almost exactly where Liam had predicted, 100 yards or so from the first. It was another complex spiral, nearly identical to the first. Yes! Liam hissed, pumping his fist. He immediately set up a tripod, documenting the find with the reverence of a museum curator. Chloe said nothing, just made her own notes, took her own photos. The third carving appeared on schedule, then the fourth. The trail, if it could be called that, was consistent, but the forest was not. It was Chloe who noticed the change first. It began with the sound. Or rather, the lack of it. The constant, cheerful chatter of the morning birds had faded. The incessant, high-pitched hum of cicadas had fallen silent. The rustle of squirrels in the undergrowth, the buzz of insects, all of it had simply stopped. She paused, tilting her head, listening intently. There was nothing. The silence was an unnatural vacuum, a void where the vibrant sounds of a living forest should have been. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, not wanting to break the strange stillness. Liam didn't look up from his camera's viewfinder. "Hear what?" I don't hear anything. It's perfect. No background noise for the shot." "That's what I mean," she pressed. "There's nothing. No birds. No insects. Nothing." He finally lowered the camera, a flicker of annoyance on his face. He listened for a moment. "It's just deep woods, Chloe. Animals are probably just steering clear of us." But his explanation felt thin, even to him. The silence was too absolute, too profound. The air itself seemed to have grown heavy and still, the light filtering through the canopy taking on a flat, lifeless quality. They found the fifth carving an hour later. It was etched into a large, pale birch tree that stood alone in a small clearing. As Liam set up his gear again, Chloe approached the tree, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. The feeling she'd had yesterday, the small nagging paradox, was now impossible to ignore. The first carving on the old oak had been deeply weathered, its edges softened by time. The subsequent ones had seemed slightly less so. This one was
So
different.
you can leave the
The wood
fly
inside
in
the
there.
deep grooves was a pale, almost white
Because you
color,
just
the raw
put
flesh
the-
of the tree. There was no discoloration, no
coals
moss, no
together?
decay. A tiny, sticky
That's as
bead of
tall
sap
as
oozed
you.
from the edge of the spiral, looking like a fresh tear.
Yeah.
It looked as though it had been carved no more than a week ago. Her mind reeled. It was an impossible contradiction. A symbol that was stylistically thousands of years old, yet physically it was practically brand new. This was a piece of blatant, chilling foreshadowing, a clue that screamed of wrongness. "Liam," she said, her voice tight. "Look at this. Just look at the wood." He knelt beside her, his triumphant expression faltering as he saw what she was pointing at. He ran a finger over the pale cut. "Whoa. That's weird." "Weird? Liam, that's impossible," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "An ancient carving can't be fresh. It violates every law of archaeology, of biology, of common sense." He stood up, shaking his head, already rebuilding his wall of optimistic denial. His desire to believe was a formidable thing. Okay, so it's an anomaly. Maybe this type of tree, the sap has some kind of crazy preservative property. Maybe that's part of the discovery. A perfectly preserved trail. But Chloe wasn't listening. She was looking past him, down the invisible path that led to the next symbol. The silence, the stillness, the impossible freshness of the carving, it all added up to a single terrifying conclusion. This wasn't a trail leading to a discovery. It was bait. And with every step they took, the trap was closing in around them. They walked for another hour in a strained and heavy silence. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the forest floor and the rhythmic thump of Liam's tripod against his pack. Liam tried to fill the void, pointing out different species of fungus or speculating about the carving's origins for his camera, but his usual enthusiasm was a thin veneer over a current of unease. Chloe didn't respond. She was too busy listening to the silence, her senses on high alert, scanning the unchanging wall of trees around them. Finally, Liam called for a break. They found a small clearing where a massive, moss-covered boulder sat like a sleeping giant. They dropped their packs, the relief from the weight a momentary comfort. Liam, ever the optimist, tried to reset the mood. "Okay, hydration is key for historical discovery," he said, pulling out his water bottle. "We're probably the first people to stand in this exact spot in 100 years. Maybe more." Chloe sank down onto the moss, her back against the boulder. She took a long drink of water, the cool liquid doing little to calm the frantic hummingbird of anxiety in her chest. She looked back the way they had come. From this vantage point, she could just see the last tree they had passed, a tall, straight poplar, about 40 yards away. She remembered it clearly. The spiral had been deeply cut, and next to it was a small, crudely etched stick figure. It had been the first carving to feature a distinctly human shape, and she'd found it oddly comforting, a little sign of humanity in this strange, silent place. She had taken a photo, as she always did. The figure had been standing straight, its arms out to its sides, as if in greeting. She finished her water, screwed the cap back on, and pushed herself to her feet. "Ready?" Liam asked, already shouldering his pack. Chloe nodded, but as she turned to follow him, a strange, inexplicable impulse made her stop. She felt a powerful, magnetic urge to look back at that poplar one last time. She turned. The tree was still there, the afternoon light filtering through the leaves and dappling its pale bark. The spiral was just as she remembered, but the stick figure was different. A cold wave washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. She blinked hard, certain her eyes were playing tricks on her. But the image remained. The figure was no longer standing straight with its arms out. Its back was now bent, hunched over in a clear posture of submission. Its head was tilted down, and its thin, stick-like arms were no longer at its sides. They were raised over its head, as if shielding itself from a terrible, unseen blow. It was a perfect, universal depiction of cowering fear. "No," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers suddenly clumsy and numb. She found the picture she had taken less than an hour ago. She zoomed in. There it was. The carving on her screen showed the figure standing tall, arms outstretched. The carving on the tree before her was a thing of terror. It was an objective, verifiable, impossible change. This was the first small, ambiguous, and deeply unsettling event that broke the rules of the world. "Liam," she said, her voice choked and strange. "Stop. Come back here. Now." He turned, an annoyed look on his face. "Chloe, come on, we're losing light." He saw her expression, though, and the annoyance was replaced by concern. He walked back to her. "What is it?" She couldn't speak. She just held up the phone, showing him the picture, and then pointed a trembling finger at the tree. He looked at the phone. He looked at the tree. His face went pale. For a moment, she saw true fear flicker in his eyes. But then, it was gone, replaced by a frantic, desperate search for reason. Okay, so that's a different tree," he said quickly. "We must have gotten turned around. That's not the same one." "It is, Liam," she said, her voice shaking. "You can see the oddly shaped branch to its left. It's the same tree." Then it's the angle," he insisted, his voice a little too loud. "The sun has moved. The shadows are hitting it differently, making it look bent. That's all it is. A trick of the light." He was actively trying and failing to find logical explanations. "It's not the shadows," she whispered, her eyes locked on the cowering figure. "The lines are in a different place." He ran a hand through his hair, his mind grasping at any possible straw of logic. Maybe there were always two carvings, one on each side, and we're just seeing the other side now? But they both knew that was a lie. Chloe looked at him, at his desperate, pleading eyes, and she understood. He didn't want to see it. He couldn't allow himself to see it, because to see it would be to admit that his great discovery was something else entirely. It would mean admitting that they were in terrible danger. His dismissal, his refusal to accept the impossible truth right in front of them, made her feel a profound and sudden chill. The unease she had been carrying all day had finally crystallized into pure, tangible fear. She was standing next to her best friend, but she had never felt more alone. Liam didn't wait for Chloe to agree. He simply turned and continued down the invisible path, his pace faster now, a man trying to outrun a truth he refused to acknowledge. Chloe hesitated for a long moment, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The urge to turn and run, to sprint back the way they had come, was a screaming physical need. But to leave Liam alone? That was unthinkable. With a sense of grim finality, she took a deep breath and followed him, stepping deeper into the silent, watchful woods. The next hour was a tense, silent march. Liam had stopped filming, his camera hanging uselessly at his side. The strange occurrences had now become more frequent, more direct, and much harder to deny. The carvings they found were no longer just static symbols. A terrifying, frantic narrative was beginning to unfold in the bark of the trees. The next stick figure they found was not just cowering. It was on its knees, its stick arms covering its head. The one after that showed the figure actively running, its legs bent in a posture of desperate flight. Then, they found a carving that made Chloe's blood run cold. It depicted two figures. One was on the ground, and the other was trying to pull it to its feet. And on the right side of the carving, the wood of the tree had been savaged by a series of deep, chaotic gashes, a furious, shapeless representation of the thing they were running from. "Liam, look," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "They're not just symbols anymore. It's a story. They're telling us what happened. They're running from something." Liam stared at the carving, his face pale. His usual arsenal of rationalizations was beginning to fail him, but his ambition fought one last, desperate battle. It's a hunt," he stammered, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "They're telling the story of a great hunt, a successful one. This is incredible. Documentation." But his words were hollow. The figures in the bark were not hunters. They were prey. It was the smell that hit them first, a thick, coppery scent that clung to the heavy, still air. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, out of place and deeply wrong in this clean, green world. Liam stopped, his head up, sniffing the air like a nervous animal. The smell was stronger just off the trail, from behind a thicket of ferns. Holding his breath, he pushed the broad, green leaves aside. The deer lay in a small, sun-dappled clearing, or what was left of it. Its body had been brutally, impossibly torn apart. This was not the work of a bear or a wolf. There were no clean cuts from teeth, no claw marks in the hide. The flesh looked as if it had been ripped and twisted by some immense blunt force. The bones snapped like twigs. It was a scene of pure, savage violence, a grotesque sculpture of death left in the center of the silent woods. Liam let out a small, choked sound and stumbled back, his face ashen. He had seen predator kills before. This was not that. This was an abomination. But it was Chloe, her mind trained to see details, who noticed the true horror. The ground around the deer was soft, damp earth, still holding the faint impressions of their own boots. It was a perfect surface to hold a track. She scanned the ground in a slow, deliberate circle around the mangled corpse. Her heart, which was already pounding, seemed to stop altogether. "Liam," she said, her voice barely audible. "The tracks." He looked at her, his eyes wide and confused. "What?" "There are no tracks," she whispered. The ground was pristine. There were no paw prints, no hoof prints from the deer's struggle, no sign of any predator approaching or leaving. It was as if the deer had simply materialized in this spot in the midst of being torn apart by an invisible phantom force. That was the moment Liam's denial finally, completely shattered. He stared at the pristine ground, his brain trying and failing to form a logical explanation. There was none. The camera hanging from his neck felt like a useless, childish toy. The grand, historical discovery he had dreamed of was a lie. The truth was something far older, far more dangerous. And it was here with them, in this silent, watchful place. They stood there for a long time, staring at the impossible scene. The coppery smell of blood thick in their throats. And the silence of the forest, which had been merely an absence of sound, now felt like a presence in itself. It was a heavy, malicious, and expectant hush. It was the silence of a hunter that has just made a fresh kill. A hunter that knows you are watching and is simply waiting to see what you will do next. They stumbled back from the clearing, away from the grotesque tableau of the deer, moving with a shared, unspoken urgency. Liam's face was a pale, waxy mask, his eyes wide with a horror he could no longer rationalize away. His ambition, the powerful engine that had driven them this deep into the wilderness, had finally sputtered and died, replaced by a cold and unfamiliar terror. The silence of the woods pressed in, no longer just expectant but seeming to mock them, to enjoy their fear. They walked for 100 yards before Chloe suddenly stopped. She wasn't looking around nervously anymore. Her eyes were unfocused, staring into the middle distance, her expression one of intense, terrifying concentration. Liam stopped a few paces ahead and turned, a questioning look on his face. "The spirals," Chloe said, her voice a low, academic murmur, as if she were working through a complex problem in a lecture hall. "The repetition. The way they draw the eye inward. And the figures. The warnings." Her eyes suddenly snapped into focus, finding Liam's. The fear was still there, but now it was sharpened by a terrifying clarity. "Oh my God, Liam, I've been so stupid. I've been trying to read it like a map." "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "It's not a map," she said, her words coming faster now, a torrent of academic realization crashing into their horrific reality. In nearly every proto-culture, from Celtic druids to ancient Siberian tribes, complex spirals aren't used for navigation. They're used for containment, for confusion. They're a form of apotropaic magic, a ward, a fence. She took a step toward him, her eyes burning with a terrible certainty. "We haven't been following a trail to a discovery. We've been walking the perimeter of a cage. These carvings, they're the bars. And for the last 3 hours," she said, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper, "we've been on the wrong side of the fence." The theory that had collapsed in Liam's mind was now being replaced by something infinitely worse. His last defense, his final desperate attempt to find a logical explanation, was to lash out. "A cage? A magic fence?" he scoffed, the sound harsh and brittle. "Chloe, listen to yourself. We're explorers, not characters in some fantasy novel. It's a territorial marker. A very aggressive one, okay, but that's all it is. An animal we haven't identified yet. An animal that leaves no tracks," she shot back, her voice rising. "An animal that changes carvings on trees? Open your eyes. The stick figures aren't telling a story about a hunt. They're a warning, a desperate message to anyone who finds this place. This is what happens when you cross the line. This trail doesn't lead to a lost village, Liam. It leads to whatever is in the center of that circle. This isn't a discovery. It's a prison." That one word prison hung in the dead air between them. It was the final, fatal blow to Liam's dream. The grand discovery that was meant to launch his career was, in fact, a centuries-old tomb, a place of death, and he had walked them right into it. The shame, the terror, and the anger of his own foolishness boiled over. "You've wanted to turn back since we got here," he snarled, his voice dripping with a venom born of pure fear. "You're just looking for an excuse because you're scared. You're letting your imagination run wild. We're on the verge of the biggest find of the century, and you want to run away because of some campfire story you've cooked up in your head. You're being paranoid." The accusation hit Chloe like a slap. She stared at him, her expression hardening from fear into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. Their friendship, the very reason she was here, seemed to dissolve in that moment, leaving them as two strangers, utterly isolated from each other in their terror. "You're damn right I'm scared, Liam," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Any sane person would be. That deer was not killed by an animal. Those carvings are changing. This place is actively, intelligently hostile, and I am not going to be the next body that someone finds at the base of a tree." She took a deliberate step backward in the direction they had come. "I am turning back. Now, you can come with me and we can try to find our way out of this together. Or you can stay here and keep chasing your ghost story. But I'm done. She held his gaze for a long moment, giving him a final chance to choose reason over ambition. Liam stood frozen, his face a war of conflicting emotions. He looked past her, back the way they had come, towards a safety that now seemed 100 miles away. Then he looked forward, down the silent, waiting path towards the heart of the prison where his great, terrible discovery still waited. The conflict between them had reached its absolute peak. A silent, terrible standoff in the heart of a forest that was waiting patiently for one of them to make the wrong choice. Chloe took a final hard look at him, her expression a mixture of pity and terror, and then she turned. Her first step back the way they had come was a definitive, final act. The friendship, the expedition, it was all over. Liam felt a surge of pure, cold panic that had nothing to do with the woods. He couldn't do this alone, and he couldn't let her go alone. Wait, he called out, his voice cracking. Chloe, just wait. She stopped but didn't turn around. One more look, he said, his mind racing, grasping for one final desperate gambit. From above. Let me just see it from above. If it's a straight line, we keep going. If it's anything else, we go back. Together. I swear. She was silent for a long moment, her back still to him. Finally, she gave a slow, weary nod. It wasn't forgiveness or even an agreement. It was an indulgence, a final concession to the friend she thought she knew. Liam didn't waste the opportunity. He shrugged off his pack and pulled out the hard-shell case containing his drone. This was his last tool of reason, his last piece of objective, technological truth. It would prove him right. It had to. The high-pitched electronic whir of the drone's rotors was a violent alien sound in the dead silent forest. The small four-propeller machine lifted off the mossy ground, hovered for a moment, and then ascended with a confident, piercing buzz. Liam's eyes were glued to the bright screen of the controller, his thumbs working the joysticks with practiced ease. Chloe stood beside him, her arms crossed, watching the screen with a grim, fatalistic expression. At first, the view was just a chaotic sea of green, the unbroken canopy of the ancient forest. Climbing to 300 feet. Liam narrated out of nervous habit, his voice a low murmur. As the drone rose higher, patterns began to emerge. They could see the slight variations in the terrain, the darker patches of denser growth, and they could see the gaps, faint but visible. They could just make out the clearings and the individual, pale trees where they had seen the carvings. Liam was trying to trace the line, to connect the dots. See? He said, a note of strained triumph in his voice. It's a line. It's heading northeast. But as the drone continued its ascent, reaching its maximum altitude of 400 feet, the true picture resolved itself on the screen. And it was horrifying. It wasn't a line. Chloe had been right. It was a circle, a perfect and massive ring of carved trees, a stark, pale scar against the deep green of the forest. And inside that circle was another, smaller, concentric ring. It wasn't a trail, it wasn't a map. It was a bullseye, a prison, and their tiny, insignificant forms were standing just a few hundred yards from its dead center. Liam's breath caught in his throat. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, pale white. His grand theory, his heroic discovery, it all collapsed in that single terrible image. He hadn't been following the path of a lost tribe. He had been leading them deeper and deeper into a cage. This was it. The major, undeniable event that confirmed the threat was real, supernatural, and lethally dangerous. Before either of them could even speak, the video feed on the screen began to glitch. Bars of static tore across the image. The colors bled and warped, the perfect circle distorting into a nightmarish swirl. And then, from the controller's small speaker, a sound erupted. It was a high-pitched, piercing shriek, a sound that was impossibly horribly organic. It was a sound of pure, territorial rage, a shriek of something ancient and unseen screaming its fury at the mechanical insect that had invaded its sky. The camera view on the screen spun wildly, a chaotic, nauseating blur of green and blue. For a single terrifying frame, the feed caught a glimpse of something not a solid shape but a distortion in the air near the drone, a shimmering, heat haze ripple in the shape of a man, and then the screen went completely, totally black. The shriek cut off. The screen displayed two stark white words, "Signal lost." The sudden, absolute silence was more deafening than the scream. The confident whir of the drone in the sky above was gone. Liam stood there, his hands still clutching the dead controller, his thumbs resting on useless joysticks. They had lost their eyes, their map, their one technological advantage. They were now blind, on the ground, and they knew, with absolute certainty, that they were trapped inside a cage with something that was actively, violently hostile. The stakes had been dramatically raised. Liam finally lowered the controller, his hands trembling. He turned to look at Chloe, his eyes wide with a terror that now perfectly mirrored her own. His ambition was a pile of ash. "You were right," he whispered, his voice the broken sound of a man who had just seen the world for what it truly was. "Oh God, Chloe, you were right." The shared terror in Liam's eyes was a horrific kind of comfort. His ambition had been a wall between them, but its collapse had left them united in their fear. There was no more debate, no more theorizing. There was only the primal, screaming need to get out. "Back the way we came," Chloe said, her voice a low, steady command that cut through Liam's shock. "We follow the carvings backward. It's the only way." Liam nodded, his movements stiff and robotic. He shoved the dead drone controller into his pack, the useless piece of technology now feeling like a block of lead. He shouldered his pack, his eyes darting nervously towards the silent trees. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Would it let them leave? They took their first tentative steps back along the invisible trail, their eyes locked on the last carved tree they had passed. They had made it maybe 50 yards when the forest began to change again. It started at their feet. A thin white mist began to rise from the damp, mossy ground, coiling around their ankles like ghostly snakes. It wasn't a natural fog rolling in from a distance. It was materializing from the earth itself. A cold, damp steam that had the thick, musty smell of a freshly opened grave. "What is this?" Liam stammered, stopping in his tracks. "Keep moving," Chloe urged, but her voice was laced with a new and terrible panic. The mist was rising with an impossible speed, thickening from a thin vapor to an opaque, churning wall of white in a matter of seconds. It swirled around their knees, then their waist, then their shoulders. It was unnaturally cold, a biting, damp chill that seeped through their clothes and into their bones. Within a minute, their world had shrunk to a claustrophobic 10-foot circle of visibility. The trees, the trail, the sky, all of it was gone, erased by an impenetrable, suffocating whiteness. They were physically cut off, plunged into a sensory deprivation chamber with no walls. "Liam?" Chloe's voice from only a few feet away sounded muffled and distant. "Are you there?" "I'm here," he answered, his own voice sounding dead and flat in the thick air. He fumbled in his pack, his hands shaking, and pulled out his compass. It was their last hope, a tool that operated on the fundamental laws of the planet. He held it flat in his palm. The needle, which should have been locked steadily on magnetic north, was spinning like a top, a frantic, chaotic dance that defied all logic. It wasn't just useless, it was mocking them. "The compass is gone," he said, his voice hollow. Chloe pulled out her phone, a desperate, futile gesture. The screen glowed with the familiar words, "No signal." She switched to the offline map. The little blue dot that represented their location was no longer just floating in a sea of green. It was jumping. 1 second it showed them miles to the south. The next, it flickered and reappeared to the northeast. Then it split into 2, 3, 4 dots, all blinking erratically across the Quindovation screen before vanishing completely, leaving only the blank, unlabeled map. The technology wasn't just failing. It felt like it was being actively, playfully, corrupted. The fog was a living thing. It muffled sound, it distorted distance, it played tricks on the mind. A snapping twig sounded as if it was right beside their ears. A rustle of leaves seemed to come from every direction at once. Their paranoia began to feed on the uncertainty, their own internal monologues starting to fray. They stood back to back, a tiny, isolated island of warmth in a cold white ocean, turning in slow circles, trying to find a landmark, a tree, anything to anchor them in a world that had lost all its bearings. It was in that moment of absolute blindness and disorientation that the final crushing realization settled upon them. They weren't just lost in a fog. To be lost, there must be a world to be lost in. This felt different. The speed, the smell, the way it had risen from the ground to consume them. It wasn't a weather event. It was an action. The forest hadn't just hidden the path. It had removed the world. They were no longer in the Monongahela National Forest. They were somewhere else. A place that looked and felt like a forest but was in fact the inside of the trap. The word that bloomed in Liam's mind was not lost. It was swallowed. They had been swallowed whole. "It knows we're trying to leave," he whispered into the dense whiteness. The words more a statement of fact than a guess. And from the fog just ahead of them, he thought he heard a soft scraping sound, like a sharp stone being dragged across the bark of a tree. The scraping sound was sharp, deliberate, and close. It was the sound of a pointed stone being dragged across wood, a sound of marking, of claiming. It stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving a silence that was somehow worse, a silence that now held the memory of that sound. They stood frozen for a full minute, back to back, their fucked, breathing shallow, listening. But there was nothing. "We can't stay here," Chloe whispered, her voice barely a tremor in the thick, dead air. "It knows where we are. We're sitting ducks." She was right. To stay still was to wait for an attack. To move was to risk walking directly into one. They chose movement. "Okay," Liam said, his own voice a strained whisper. "Okay." We link arms. We do not let go, for any reason, and we try to walk in a straight line. If we hit the circle of trees, we'll know it. It was a pathetic plan, a child's strategy against the dark, but it was all they had. They linked their arms tightly, a small, two-person island of terrified humanity, and took their first blind step into the white void. The ground was uneven, covered in a slick carpet of unseen moss and treacherous roots. They moved at a snail's pace, their boots making soft, sucking sounds in the damp earth. The world was a claustrophobic, featureless bubble of gray. They had managed maybe 20 feet when the forest conspired against them. Liam's foot caught on a gnarled root hidden beneath the moss, and he pitched forward with a startled grunt. His arm was instinctively torn from Chloe's grasp as he threw his hands out to break his fall. He landed hard on his palms and knees, the impact jarring him. The entire event took less than 3 seconds. "I'm okay," he gasped, pushing himself up. "I'm okay." He turned back to where Chloe had been. She was gone. The fog, thick and cloying, had surged into the tiny gap between them and she had been erased. A hot, immediate panic seized him. "Chloe?" he called out, his voice tight. "Chloe, I'm right here," a voice answered, and relief, pure and absolute, washed over him. It was Chloe's voice. "Liam, over here!" it called, the sound coming from his left, about 20 yards away. "I found it. I think I found the edge of the circle." It sounded hopeful, excited even. He took a half step in that direction, a giddy laugh of relief bubbling in his chest. "Liam, don't move!" another voice screamed. This one from his right, much closer, and filled with a raw, desperate terror. It was also Chloe's voice. He froze, his body locked in place, his head snapping between the two identical, impossible sounds. The hopeful voice called again from the left. "Hurry! It's this way!" The terrified voice from the right just screamed his name. He was caught in a horrifying auditory illusion, a psychological crossroads. One voice promised salvation, the other promised something else. He didn't know which one was a lie, but he knew with sickening certainty that a wrong choice would be his last. His trust in his own senses, his most basic tool for navigating the world, was shattered. He chose the terrified voice. It felt more real. "Chloe, keep talking!" he yelled to his right. "Where are you?" A moment later, her shape materialized out of the fog, her face a pale mask of horror. They scrambled towards each other, their hands finding each other in the gloom, their grips iron tight. The voice from the left called out one more time, a questioning, almost wounded "Liam?" before it fell silent. They stood there, clinging to each other, their hearts hammering in a frantic, unsynchronized rhythm. The terror had a new name now. This wasn't just a monster. It was a mimic. An intelligent, sadistic thing that was learning. As they stood there, trying to catch their breath, trying to process the impossible, Chloe felt a puff of cold air on the back of her neck, as if someone had just leaned in close. And a voice, a perfect, chilling replica of Liam's, whispered directly into her ear, so close she could feel the phantom vibration of it. "It's your fault," it whispered. "You should have let me keep going." She let out a small, strangled scream and spun around, her arm lashing out, but she hit nothing but the thick, empty fog. The real Liam was still in front of her, his face contorted in confusion and fear. What's wrong?" he asked, his own voice coming from his own mouth. He hadn't said a thing. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a new and more intimate horror. It wasn't just trying to separate them anymore. It was inside their defenses. It was whispering their own worst fears to them, using their own voices as a weapon of psychological warfare. Their internal monologue was beginning to fray, the line between their own thoughts and the entity's whispers blurring into a paranoid nightmare. They were no longer just lost in the woods. They were lost in their own heads. They huddled together, back to back, in the center of the silent, white void, too afraid to move, and now almost too afraid to speak, terrified of the voice that might answer. They stood frozen in the white, silent world, a prison of thick fog. To speak was to invite mimicry. To move was to risk separation. They were trapped in a state of pure, paranoid paralysis. How long they stood there, minutes or an hour, they couldn't say. Time itself had become a casualty of the fog. But then a new sound began, one that was not a mimicry of their own voices. It was a low, rhythmic, and deeply resonant scraping, like a heavy stone being dragged in slow circles across the damp earth. It was a sound of patient, endless labor. And with the sound, the fog began to change. In one direction, the oppressive white wall seemed to thin, resolving into a translucent grayish curtain. A faint, sickly pale light filtered through it. Not the warm light of the sun, but a cold, dead illumination, like the light of a long dead star. It wasn't an invitation to safety, but it was the only break in the suffocating whiteness. With a shared, unspoken understanding, they chose the lesser of two evils. Clinging to each other, they moved toward the light. As they walked, the fog receded with an unnatural uniformity, peeling back like a stage curtain. They emerged into a large, perfectly circular clearing. The air here was shockingly clear and utterly still. The ground was a carpet of black, rich, and completely barren earth, not a single blade of grass or sprig of moss to be seen. The scraping sound was gone, and the silence that remained was absolute, the silence of a tomb. And in the exact center of this dead space stood the tree. It was a gargantuan ancient oak, a monstrous titan of a tree that was impossibly large for this region. Its trunk was a gnarled, bulging mass of wood, thick as a small house. Its upper branches were bare, black, and twisted, reaching up towards the gray, overcast sky like the skeletal fingers of a buried giant. But it was the bark that held their horrified attention. It was not the natural, grooved texture of an oak. The entire trunk, from its base to as high as they could see, was a chaotic, horrifying tapestry of carvings. There were thousands of them. Spirals and symbols were carved one on top of the other, a dense, overlapping mess that spoke of centuries of frantic, desperate work. The orderly warnings of the perimeter were gone, replaced by a visual record of pure terror. They could make out stick figures, hundreds of them, all in postures of abject horror, arms thrown up, mouths open in silent screams, bodies bent and broken. Some were depicted running from a shapeless, chaotic mass of gouges. Others were shown being dragged, pulled, or simply falling into nothingness. It was a wall of screaming faces, a history of suffering etched into the living wood. This was the final, terrible warning. Drawn forward by a morbid, horrified fascination, they approached the base of the monstrous tree, and there, nestled amongst the gnarled roots, was the source of the faint, scraping sound. It was a pile of rotting, discarded history, the remnants of those who had come before. They saw a brass compass, its casing green with age, the glass cracked in the needle, long since dissolved into rust. Beside it lay a canvas backpack, a popular style from the 1970s, its fabric now a rotting, mildewed mess, a single leather strap still stubbornly intact. A little further, half buried in the black earth, was a bright yellow disposable camera from the 90s, its plastic casing split open, the film within exposed and ruined. And, near the top of the pile, a piece of modern technology that made Liam's blood run cold. A smartphone, its screen a spider web of shattered glass. Its case identical to a model that had been released only 2 years ago. The story of this place was not written in ancient history. It was a story that was still being written. This was the undeniable event that confirmed the threat was real, supernatural, and lethally dangerous. They stared at the pile, at the pathetic, mundane artifacts that represented entire lives, all ending in this one terrible spot. They looked up at the screaming faces carved into the tree. Then they looked down at their own modern gear, their high-tech packs, their own smartphones, Liam's dead drone controller. The connection was an unspoken, soul-crushing certainty. This wasn't a discovery. It was a pattern. They were not the first to follow the trail. They were not the first to see this tree. They were simply the next offerings, the next story to be carved into the bark. Hopelessness was a cold, heavy blanket smothering thought, smothering everything but the sight of that pathetic pile of lost things and the screaming faces carved in the bark. They were just the next chapter in a very old, very hungry story. Liam sank to his knees, the last of his strength leaving him. This was it. This was the end. They were in the heart of the prison, and the warden had found them. But as Liam surrendered to despair, Chloe's mind, honed by years of academic discipline, refused to shut down. It did the only thing it knew how to do. It looked for patterns. Her eyes darted from the chaotic, overlapping, frantic carvings on the monstrous central tree to the memory of the symbols on the perimeter, the ones that had led them here. And in that moment of pure, abject terror, she saw it. A sliver of impossible hope. "They're different," she whispered, her voice a raw, urgent thing. Liam looked up at her, his face a blank mask of defeat. "Liam, the carvings, they're different." She grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "The ones on the outside, they were neat, deliberate, spaced out. They were a line, a boundary." She pointed a trembling finger at the chaotic mess on the tree before them. This is a mess. This is terror. These are the carvings of the people who were trapped inside." The gears in Liam's mind, rusted shut by fear, began to slowly turn. He looked from the tree to the woods and back to Chloe, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "It's a cage," Chloe said, her theory now a torrent of desperate logic. "And we've been walking along the bars, the outer ring. It's not just a warning to keep people out. It's a fence to keep it in. And if it's a fence, the bars have to mean something. They have to have power." This was it. The moment they stopped running aimlessly and began to face the source of the horror. "That's our only way out. We have to get back to the perimeter." It was a sliver of a chance, a desperate gamble based on a half-baked theory of supernatural architecture. But it was better than the certainty of dying here. As they turned to leave the dead, barren clearing, a flicker of movement in the corner of Liam's eye made him freeze. "Chloe," he breathed. "Don't move." In the space between two of the outer trees, the air was wrong. It was shimmering, rippling, like the heat haze off a blistering asphalt road. But there was no heat. It was a cold, silent distortion, a patch of the world that had come unstuck from reality.
How's yours?
As they watched, the shimmer coalesced, slightly, taking on a vague, man-like shape before dissolving back into an indistinct ripple. It was there, and it was not there. A localized breakdown of physics, a predator that hunted by being a blind spot in the world. It was watching them. "Okay," Chloe whispered, her voice shaking but her resolve hardening. "The open spaces are its territory. The trees are ours. We move from tree to tree, now." And so the final, terrifying confrontation began. It was not a fight, but a deadly, high-stakes game of hide-and-seek. Chloe pointed to a carved tree about 30 yards away. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. They broke into a desperate sprint across the open, barren ground. The feeling of being exposed was a physical weight, a scream of vulnerability in the back of their minds. Liam risked a glance over his shoulder. The shimmer was flowing silently and swiftly through the clearing behind them, not running but pouring like a ripple of clear oil across the ground, effortlessly keeping pace. They reached the tree, slamming their backs against the rough bark, their lungs burning. They peered around the edge. The shimmer stopped about 20 feet away, hovering in the open space, seeming to watch them, waiting. It couldn't, or wouldn't, get closer. Chloe's theory was right. The carvings were a sanctuary, a tiny temporary island of safety in an ocean of death. They caught their breath, their eyes locked on the patient. Silent distortion. It made no sound, gave no sign of aggression. It simply waited. The psychological pressure of it was immense. They were trapped, but they had a path. They were being hunted, but they had a shield. The rest of the journey would be a terrifying, Life or death dash from one of these small islands to the next, with the patient, shimmering death flowing silently in the spaces between. The escape was a terrifying, breathless rhythm. A desperate 30-yard dash across an open killing floor, followed by the heart-pounding relief of slamming their backs against the rough, carved bark of another tree. They'd done it 3 times, a frantic, repeated cycle of terror and sanctuary. With each successful jump, a sliver of hope returned. They were making progress, following the carvings in reverse, moving slowly but surely toward the outer edge of the circle. But the entity was learning. Its silent, flowing pursuit wasn't working. It realized they understood the rules of the cage, so it decided to change the game. As they pressed themselves against the trunk of a gnarled pine, catching their breath for the next run, the attack began. It started with sound. A low, wet, guttural growl erupted in the air, seeming to come from inches behind Liam's head. He flinched violently, spinning around with a choked cry, but there was nothing there but the solid wood of the tree. Then, from the open space in front of them, the sound of a woman weeping softly began to echo. It sounded hauntingly like Liam's late mother, a sound from his childhood that he hadn't heard in 20 years. He squeezed his eyes shut. "It's not real," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's just trying to mess with us." The entity turned its attention to Chloe. As they prepared to make their next dash, a shimmering, translucent image flickered into existence in the woods just beyond their target tree. It was the figure of a young boy, about 10 years old, looking lost and terrified. It was her younger brother, Mark. He looked exactly as he had the day he'd gotten lost at a state fair years ago, an event that was still Chloe's most terrifying childhood memory. "Chloe?" the apparition whispered, its voice a perfect replica of her brother's. "I am scared. I can't find my way back." Chloe froze, her heart lurching with an impossible, irrational flood of emotion. Liam saw the look on her face and grabbed her arm, his grip high and tight. "Chloe, look at me," he said, his voice sharp. "It's not real. It's not real. It's a trick." She tore her eyes away from the phantom, her breath catching in a sob. The illusion wavered and vanished. The entity was becoming more desperate, its attacks more personal, more cruel. It was using their own memories, their own loves as weapons. They were close now. They could feel it. The air seemed lighter ahead, the oppressive atmosphere of the circle thinning. One more dash, one more tree, and then the outer perimeter. "This is it," Liam said, pointing to the final tree before the edge. "Ready?" Chloe nodded, her face a grim, determined mask. They ran. As they sprinted across the final open stretch, the entity launched its final, most desperate assault. Liam saw a figure stumble out from behind the target tree, collapsing onto the ground just off the path. It was Chloe. Her leg was bent at a sickening, unnatural angle, and her face was a mask of pure agony. "Liam!" she screamed, her voice filled with pain and terror. "My leg! I think it's broken. Help me!" The real Chloe was still running, a few paces ahead of him, yelling for him to keep going. But his mind was a chaos of conflicting information. He saw her ahead, and he saw her, broken and screaming, on the ground. The sight of her in pain, the crushing guilt he felt for leading her into this nightmare, it all coalesced into a single overriding instinct. He couldn't leave her. He faltered, his momentum slowing, and then he turned, taking 3 quick steps off the path towards the illusion. Chloe reached the final tree, the sanctuary, and spun around, a triumphant cry dying on her lips. She saw Liam, disoriented, heading the wrong way. And she saw the shimmer. It was no longer flowing. It was converging, a ripple of distorted air moving with terrifying speed towards Liam's exposed position. There was no time to think. She screamed his name, but he was lost in the hallucination. With a desperate, guttural cry of her own, she abandoned the safety of the carved tree and launched herself back into the open, back into the entity's hunting ground. It was the peak of the conflict. She hit Liam with the force of a linebacker, a flying tackle that sent them both sprawling to the damp, mossy earth. They were completely exposed. The air around them grew instantly, bitingly cold. The world seemed to warp at the edges, the shimmer almost upon them. "It's not real!" She screamed into his face, her voice raw. "Get up!" He blinked, and the image of the injured Chloe vanished, leaving only the trees. The spell was broken. They scrambled on their hands and knees, crawling, clawing at the ground, a desperate, animalistic scramble for safety. They threw themselves the final few feet, collapsing in a heap against the rough, solid bark of the carved tree just as the shimmer flowed over the spot where they had been a second before, a silent, deadly tide that had just missed its prey. They lay in a heap at the base of the tree, chests heaving, sucking in ragged breaths of cold, dead air. The shimmer was gone. The forest was silent. For a moment there was nothing but the frantic pounding of their own hearts. Liam pushed himself up, his body a collection of screaming aches and deep bone-bruising cold. Through the trees, just beyond the last carved trunk of the perimeter, he could see it. The forest looked different. The light was warmer, the greens more vibrant. It looked alive. "Chloe," he gasped. "The edge, that's the edge of the circle." There was no plan, no countdown. Their eyes met in a shared, silent understanding. They pushed themselves to their feet and ran. They burst past the final carved tree, crossing an invisible, instantaneous threshold. The change was so abrupt it was physically jarring. The oppressive, suffocating silence that had been their constant companion shattered, and the world exploded with sound. Birds were singing, a riotous, cheerful chorus. Insects were buzzing. A warm, gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the canopy above, a sound so normal, so beautifully mundane, that it brought tears to Chloe's eyes. The heavy, cold, grave-like air was gone, replaced by the warm, sunlit air of a normal autumn afternoon. They didn't stop. They didn't celebrate. They ran. It was a blind, panicked flight, fueled by the last dregs of their adrenaline. They stumbled over roots, they pushed through low-hanging branches, not daring to look back, terrified that the silence would catch up to them. They found the faint trail that had first led them to the carvings and followed it with a desperate, single-minded focus. When they finally burst from the tree line and saw the familiar metallic glint of Liam's car, the relief was so overwhelming it almost brought them to their knees. They threw themselves inside, the sound of Liam fumbling with the keys a frantic counterpoint to the cheerful bird song outside. The engine roared to life and he slammed the car into gear, spinning tires on the gravel as he sped away, leaving the ancient, hungry prison behind them. The weeks that followed were an exercise in deliberate forgetting. They had survived, but they were forever scarred. Liam and Chloe didn't speak of what had happened. The shared trauma, which should have forged an unbreakable bond, had instead created a chasm of unspoken horror between them. To see each other was to remember, and remembering was a torment they couldn't bear. Liam's YouTube channel lay dormant, his ambition a casualty of the woods. He tried to sink back into the noise and light of the city, but the memory of the silence followed him. He couldn't sleep in the dark anymore, and the quiet of his own apartment at night was a suffocating, expectant thing. His obsession for discovery had been replaced by a new, more morbid obsession. The need for proof. The need to know he wasn't crazy. It led him one sleepless night to the corrupted files he had salvaged from the drone's memory card. He sat hunched over his laptop, the only light in his dark apartment the cold blue-white glow of the screen. Most of the footage was an unusable mess of static and glitched-out color bars. But there were a few seconds of video from the final moments, just before the shriek and the crash. He slowed it down, advancing the footage frame by agonizing frame. It was a nauseating blur of green and sky, frame after frame of nothing. He was about to give up, to consign the memory to a bad dream when he saw it. For a single solitary frame, the image stabilized. And in that frame, between the blurred trunks of two distant trees, was the distortion. It was a shapeless, shimmering ripple in the fabric of the video itself. A heat haze in a cold forest, a blind spot in reality. It was there. It was real. A cold, vindicating terror washed over him. He leaned closer, zooming in, his eyes wide, staring at the impossible proof on his screen. At that exact moment, the lamp on his desk flickered. He flinched. It flickered again, a frantic, stuttering pulse, and then the entire apartment was plunged into darkness, the only light now, the ghostly glow of the laptop screen with its single terrible image. The hum of the refrigerator died. The sounds of the city outside seemed to fade away. A deep, profound silence fell over the room. And in that sudden, shocking silence, a new sound began. It was faint, but unmistakable. A dry, rhythmic scratching. It was coming from his front door, out in the hallway. It was the sound of a sharp point being dragged slowly, deliberately across the surface of the wood. The final, haunting image was not on his screen. It was in his mind. The image of a spiral, a warning, being patiently carved into the one place he had thought was safe. The prison wasn't in the woods. It was a memory. And it had followed him home. The story ends there, in a dark apartment, with a sound that should not be there. The prison was left in the woods. But the nightmare, perhaps, has just found a new home. Would you have turned back when you had the chance? Or would your curiosity have been too strong? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. I read every single one. If this tale left a chill down your spine, the greatest way to support the channel is to hit the like button, subscribe to Horror Stories Audio, and ring the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss our weekly descent into madness. Sharing this experience with a fellow horror enthusiast is the best way to help our community of fear grow. Until next time, remember that some trails are not meant to be followed. Be careful of the silence. It's never truly empty. Sleep well.